If there's one thing we've learned in Washington, it's this: those who scream the loudest for transparency are usually the ones writing in invisible ink. And at 217 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, that paradox came knocking on Dan Bonino's encrypted comms. The message wasn't long, but it was precise. Alta Stuttgart, active duty, no attachments, one file, no follow-up. Dan's eyes narrowed as he opened the secure audio. A voice clean and chilling crackled into his headset. It wasn't just familiar, it was unmistakable. "Forget Trump, I got the House and the Senate." There was a 5-second pause at the end, followed by the sound of glass tapping metal, a toast, or perhaps a signal, then silence. Dan didn't move. He sat back in his chair, muttering, "If that's real, then someone's running foreign policy behind 45's back." 28 minutes later, Pam Bondi's name lit up on his screen. She didn't wait for pleasantries. "Dan, we've got to freeze," she said bluntly. "DOJ just locked my access to the Ukraine audit account. No reason, no signature, not even a timestamp on the order." Dan leaned forward, gripping his pen like a baton. "You think this came from justice?" "I think it came from above justice," Pam snapped. "And I'm guessing you just heard something I need to hear." Dan paused, then exhaled. "I've got 43 seconds of Graham speaking like he's Secretary of State, and not the US kind." By 3:08 a.m. they were on a secure line, cross-verified through a private circuit once used by DHS. Pam had already forwarded a redacted DOJ memo with a handwritten notation in the margin: "Too simple. Letters LG." "You see that?" she said. "That's him, that's the signature." "Without the signature?" Dan nodded slowly, even though she couldn't see him. "You've got bureaucratic obstruction, I've got operational betrayal." "Then we go to the Hill," she said, "but not with a flamethrower, not yet." "Let him speak, let him lie, we just need to know when to pull the pin." Dan opened a second window on his screen, overlaying Graham's travel manifest with the official Ukraine aid disbursement timeline. The overlaps weren't just frequent, they were surgical: 6 visits to Ukraine, 2 to South Carolina, aid approvals within 72 hours of each trip. "He's not a senator anymore," Dan said. "He's a ghost ambassador with a blank check." Pam hesitated, then added, "And someone's still covering for him inside DOJ. I've got a junior staffer who risked her job to slip me that memo. Get her out of DC." Dan replied flatly, "Tell her to take a vacation, disappear, and burn the original." The agreement was silent, but total: no leaks, no press, no premature strikes. "We don't win this with headlines," Pam said. "We win it with timing." "Then let's give Graham the rope," Dan concluded, "and see if he ties a ribbon or a noose." They were going to let him speak under oath, and when he did, the chain of command, the real one, not the constitutional one, might finally come into view. Pam Bondi wasn't surprised to be summoned. She was surprised by who wasn't supposed to be in the room, but was the envelope that had arrived by a courier bore no committee seal, no formal time stamp, and no staff acknowledgement. It simply said room 2168, noon, discretion expected, JR 12 o'clock sharp. Pam walked into the closed chamber in Rayern, holding nothing but a hard copy memo and an encrypted flash drive in her coat pocket. Jamie Raskin was seated in the center, hands clasped in front of him, eyes unreadable. Lindsey Graham was already there. No introduction, no explanation, no smile. His tie was loosened half an inch, not from disarray but from choreography. Pam remained standing. "There's no docket." Raskin began, glancing at Graham. "Because this isn't a hearing and nothing discussed here enters the congressional record." Pam tilted her head slightly. "Then let's stop pretending this is about decorum, and just tell me which nerve I touched." Graham leaned in, elbows on the table, tone clipped and rehearsed. "You're digging into foreign accounts tied to strategic disbursements that fall under the Armed Services Confidentiality Clause that puts you outside your clearance ban." Miss Bondi, way outside. "And what exactly are you implying?" she asked. "I'm not implying," Graham answered. "I'm informing." Raskin stepped in, voice low but deliberate. "Pam, you know the timing here is delicate. NATO's force alignment talks are entering final phase. Review your subpoenas, and I mean this with respect, could destabilize entire blocks of ongoing coordination." Pam didn't blink. She placed her hands behind her back, shoulder square. "So to clarify, investigating misused US funds is now considered a geopolitical risk. Don't twist this." Graham cut in. "You're weaponizing domestic process to interrupt a live international posture. We don't have time for your courtroom crusades. And who's we? The Senate, the Pentagon, or whatever pocket you're carrying in your left breast today?" For a brief second, Raskin seemed to smile, not out of amusement but discomfort. Graham didn't flinch. "Let me be blunt. If you proceed with publicizing your findings, I'll formally request a suspension of your classified data access, and I'll escalate this to the Ethics Committee under Code 47C, abuse of investigative authority." Pam reached slowly into her inner jacket, removed her phone, and tapped the voice recorder loud enough for them to hear the click. "Now say that again." Under non-hearing privilege, Graham stared at the device but didn't break stride. "I said your investigation compromises strategic integrity, and I'm prepared to invoke institutional response to stop it." "Thank you," she replied, voice measured. "And to be clear, are you acting independently or on behalf of someone else?" "No," answer. She picked up her phone, nodded once at Raskin, and walked out of the room without another word. 3 hours later, Dan Bongino met her in a windowless cafe booth just off Judiciary Square. He slid a manila envelope across the table. Without speaking, she slid a USB drive back. He threatened full revocation. Pam said a matter of fact, which means he's cornered. Dan replied if he had air cover he wouldn't be flinching. Raskin looked like he wanted to vanish, like he knew what Graham was sitting on but didn't want his fingerprints on it. Dan leaned back, exhaling. This hearing won't be procedural, it'll be containment until we break the seal and force everything out into the open. Then we sit, we wait, and we let him swear under oath. 48 hours later, a formal notice was dispatched to Graham's office. It contained no summary, no press detail, and no back channel courtesy. It read only, "You are required to appear, sworn testimony expected." The door didn't creak. It opened with the kind of hydraulic control designed for silent authority. Lindsey Graham stepped through with a folder tucked under his arm and a fixed expression, not one of defiance but of scripted composure. He didn't look at Pam, he didn't glance at Dan. He went straight to the center witness seat and sat down, spine straight, elbows slightly off the armrest, the posture of a man used to being the headline in his own story. Jamie Raskin gave the session into order. This hearing, convened jointly by the Committees on Judiciary and Armed Services, will examine procedural integrity and institutional oversight in the context of recent foreign policy engagements. Our objective is clarity, not condemnation. No cameras, no press pool, only the official recorders and a half-dozen staffers from each party seated in silence. Senator Graham. Raskin continued, "You may begin with your opening statement." Graham nodded. Once he unfolded a single page, read silently for 3 seconds, and then began, "I've served under 4 presidents. I've sat across from every major military chief this country's had in the last 30 years, and I've spent more time in Kiev than some ambassadors spend in their host nations." He placed the page down. "No one in this chamber understands Ukraine better than I do, not because of press briefings or headline narratives, but because I've stood there in real time under real risk and watched what it takes to defend a border without hesitation." There was no reaction from Pam or Dan. Neither flinched. Graham shifted gears. "Since 2022 I've participated in 6 Heil meetings with President Zelensky, co-sponsored 3 bipartisan military support bills, and acted as liaison during critical pre-deployment phases for aid logistics. These aren't photo ops, these are forward operating engagements sanctioned by our institutional need to prevent a European collapse." Pam didn't speak. She reached into her folder, withdrew a single sheet marked FTL:"transit logs", and placed it on the desk in front of her. Dan scribbled a line across the legal pad in front of him and slid it toward her without breaking eye contact from Graham. "He's building his own noose, let him tighten it." Minute 30. Raskin tapped his pen once on the table, signaling no interjections would be allowed, yet no challenges, not until the statement was complete. Graham concluded his preamble. "Some may choose to politicize the urgency of our posture. I choose to defend it, because in this moment, this window of geopolitical fragility, diplomacy without assertion is surrender." Then he folded the page again, placed it face down, and waited. Pam glanced at Dan, not for permission but for rhythm. They would let him keep digging. Graham's final words from the opening statement still lingered in the room like incense, heavy, intentional, and designed to outlast scrutiny. He didn't wait for a question. He launched straight into his next move. "I remember standing in Berlin, not far from where President Reagan once said, 'Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.'" He turned deliberately to Raskin as if addressing an old ally back. "Then we didn't ask the president for permission to believe in freedom. We didn't wait for consensus when tyranny threatened Europe. And today's Ukraine is no different." Dan leaned sideways, murmured under his breath, "Watch this, he's building a Reagan parallel to cut Trump off." Graham continued, "Let me be blunt. Donald Trump's posture on NATO is not just misguided, it's dangerously defeatist." His words emboldened adversaries who already doubt our resolve. Pam's eyes didn't move, but her hands tightened. Dan reached for the mic. "Chairman, I respectfully request to rebut the senator's claim as it pertains directly to current intelligence disclosures." And the executive chain of Raskin raised his hand. "Denied. Your statement does not address a direct question posed to the witness." Dan's mouth opened, but he held it. Pam scribbled something in her folder. Graham turned the screw tighter. "This is not about personalities, it's about principle. If someone in this room wants to come after me, then by all means come, but leave behind the illusion that undermining my actions somehow equates to defending American values." Pam closed her folder calmly, firmly. She lifted her hand. "Mr. Chairman, I have a prepared line of questions relating to that very principle, with your permission." Raskin interrupted, not unkindly, but firmly. "All pre-submitted questions must be reviewed prior to response. Please file your inquiry through counsel." He looked not at Pam but at Graham and nodded a subtle nod, but not to signal order, to signal alignment. Dan circled the moment in his notes and wrote one line, "Chair is compromised. We need to set the tempo now." Dan didn't circle the words "chair is compromised" for dramatic effect. He circled it because the next move had to be surgical. He reached under his folder and slid out a sealed envelope, unmarked except for a handwritten tag, Schedule GL1. "Mr. Chairman," Dan began, maintaining a steady tone, "I'd like to introduce a factual Review of the senator's international travel for the past 30 months compiled from publicly available Department of Defense records and embassy logs. Raskin didn't object yet. Graham leaned forward with a faint smirk. Dan unfolded the first page. According to flight manifests in congressional delegation logs, Senator Graham visited Ukraine 6 times in 30 months in that same period. He returned to his home state of South Carolina only twice. He paused. Senator, are you still representing the people of South Carolina, or have you taken a parallel role as unofficial envoy for the Kiev Foreign Ministry? There was a slight stir among the press pool. Graham smiled slightly too wide. Congressman, I represent the interests of the United States abroad. Sometimes that means being where leadership is needed, not where polls are taken. Kiev is a front line of global democracy. Pam glanced at the notes in front of her but didn't lift her eyes. Raskin interjected before Dan could follow up. Let's avoid questions that lean toward personal insinuation. Please redirect Mr. Bongino. Dan closed the folder slowly, wordlessly. Pam's right hand tapped the corner of a red-marked page. A Department of Energy fax, dated, stamped, and flagged. It was the freeze order on discretionary defense disbursement, signed 1 day after Graham's last Kiev trip. She traced the line with her fingertip. Dan looked over. Not yet. Pam murmured, barely audible. Let him fill his own grave. Pam sat upright, hands neatly folded, then calmly leaned toward the microphone. Mr. Chairman, she began, her tone measured, I hereby invoke Committee Rule 12 to request admission of an audio recording for public playback collected under active federal integrity protocols. Raskin didn't even lift his eyes. Miss Bondi, without documented chain of custody. Actually, she interrupted gently, you'll find the chain certified by CISA, timestamped under Red Flag Protocol 227. I'm happy to furnish the metadata to the committee. Across the table, Graham chuckled a short dismissive snort. Let her play it. Hell, if we're going to make theater out of this, might as well sell tickets. Dan leaned closer and muttered, just loud enough for the microphone to catch. Keep digging, Senator, you're close to bedrock. Pam nodded once her finger tapped the screen and a crisp voice filled the chamber. Forget Trump, I got the House and the Senate. The air froze. Even the reporters behind the barrier stopped typing. Graham blinked, but didn't flinch. Then, with the ease of a seasoned litigator, he leaned back. That was my voice, yes, but the interpretation you're pushing is frankly absurd. We were discussing hypothetical post-election contingencies, nothing more. Pam turned toward him unblinking. So you claim this was rehearsal, strategic simulation? Every serious legislator does them. If that surprises you, Miss Bondi, perhaps you've been out of the room too long. Dan raised a manila folder, flicked it open, and slid a page across the table. For the record, this recording was obtained by Lieutenant Commander Nathan Andrews during a Joint Security Council sub-briefing. It was encrypted and routed via CISA's classified evidence pipeline as part of national oversight on external influence. Raskin looked down, pretending to read notes. His voice came quiet, almost reluctant. 10-minute recess. This committee will reconvene at 11:38. As he stood, Graham whispered toward Pam with a sardonic smirk, good try, counselor, but you better come harder than that. Pam didn't look at him. She just replied softly, you haven't seen the real piece yet. 10 minutes later they returned. Pam didn't wait for protocol. Mr. Chairman, she said, voice steady but sharp, the committee may wish to reconsider early conclusions. What you just heard was not the scandal, it was merely the opening chord. The chamber had only just begun to settle from the revelation of the taped phrase, forget Trump, I got the House and the Senate, when Pam, still standing calmly, slid another sealed folder across the witness table. She didn't speak at first. She let the silence stretch. Then, with her eyes trained on Chairman Raskin, I request authorization to enter a second piece of classified evidence into the record. DOJ Internal Classification Number FC 431. It contains an interagency directive signed by Senator Graham ordering a temporary freeze on investigative funding related to Ukraine-based financial transfers. Raskin hesitated. Graham let out a faint, incredulous laugh and leaned back. Seriously, are we now weaponizing my calendar and inbox? Pam didn't flinch. She opened the document and began reading. To prevent external prosecutorial interference with ongoing diplomatic strategy and national security posture, all funding for DOJ Task Force Omega Ukraine Division shall be administratively paused for reassessment. Authorization Code LG 74. Dan's eyes narrowed. Pam continued. The document includes 3 authorizing initials, all traced to Senator Graham's office. One of them, LG, is in your handwriting, Senator. Graham raised his hands. It could have been a routing stamp. I don't micromanage. Every sheet of paper with my initials on it. Pam leaned forward, voice steady. This wasn't a routine memo. This order halted an ongoing investigation into 2 shell entities, Nixmar and East Shield Corp., that were flagged by Finansen for irregular cross-border transfers, both connected to a PXU fundraised with in 2020. Dan interjected, holding up a page of Finansen risk ratings. Those 2 entities received over $1 $4 million from a holding account in Odisha during the same month your office signed off on the funding freeze. Graham's voice dropped slightly. You're trying to paint this as something nefarious. We engage with foreign policy actors all the time. It's called diplomacy. Pam's tone cut through. Diplomacy doesn't require you to sign orders that block law enforcement from following money trails with national security implications. There was a pause. Dan flipped open another folder. One of the prosecutors whose access was revoked due to this freeze was leading a sealed subpoena on the pack. The system flagged the freeze as Tier 3 non-compliance. That's not technical, it's deliberate obstruction. Graham shook his head. That's your interpretation. Pam met his eyes. No, that's the system's label. My access was terminated without due process. I was the one leading that subpoena. The word stunned the room. Not even a cough or whisper could be heard. I was removed from the secure net. My badge scanned red. I had to log in from a secondary terminal just to notify my supervisor that I was locked out of my own investigation. Chairman Raskin glanced down, unmoving. Graham stared at the desk. Pam didn't relent. Senator, you didn't just sign a delay, you created a void in a federal audit trail during a time when Ukrainian aid was under scrutiny, and your office had direct ties to 2 dark money conduits routed through Charleston. Dan added, you want to invoke Reagan? Fine, but even Reagan never choked an investigation in his own backyard. Pam held up one final document, and just to be clear, this directive wasn't just read, it was executed within 72 hours. DOJ systems were adjusted to reflect a budgetary halt, and your office forwarded that status to the Intelligence Budget Committee with a label, risk management. That label gave the entire freeze a shield from public disclosure. Graham spoke softly. Now those decisions are made at the staff level. Pam, with no emotion, concluded, then maybe your staff belongs under oath to the silence. After Pam's final line in Part 7, that government attorney was me, was not merely theatrical, it was a tactical breach. The entire room froze, not out of disbelief, but calculation. For the first time, Senator Graham did not respond. Dan Bongino, seated upright with both hands folded neatly, clicked the remote. A new slide appeared marked Expenditure File 82D, Overseas Delegation, Budapest, Krakow, Kiev. Madam Chair, we request to admit into record Exhibit D, classified, itemized expenses for Senator Graham's most recent international tour, totaling $84,93327, sourced from budget code 716 CFE, reserved strictly for approved diplomatic channels. The chairman nodded. No objection was raised. Pam stood without looking at Graham. Line item $1,486,100 for a closed-door gala reception at the Kempinski Hotel, Budapest, attended by foreign dignitaries, private U.S. defense contractors, and 2 individuals flagged by OFAC for foreign lobbying. She turned the page. Item $27,191,400 for a lease Bombardier Challenger 300 registered under a pass-link private firm. No manifest filed with the State Department. No mission clearance from the executive. Graham finally spoke, voice low, tight. My office informed the Committee on Foreign Relations these were urgent strategic meetings, time sensitive, no games. Pam didn't flinch. Then where's the readout, Senator? Where's the transcript? Where's even a memo, redacted or otherwise, showing what policy you were authorized to negotiate? Graham's tone stiffened, sharpened. We were correcting course where this administration failed. Ukraine was losing diplomatic ground. Hungary was moving closer to Beijing. Dan interjected, unblinking with respect. Senator, those shifts do not grant you constitutional authority to function as a foreign emissary. He tapped the next document. Section 953 of the Logan Act states explicitly, any U.S. citizen without authority of the United States, who directly or indirectly commences or carries on any correspondence or intercourse with any foreign government shall be fined or imprisoned. This statute is not ceremonial. It has been cited in 5 legal memoranda since 2005 and invoked twice by the DOJ under threat of indictment. Pam added, and we now have evidence that your delegation discussed mutual defense terms and oil transit negotiations directly with 2 Eastern European governments. Graham's face flushed. He rose slightly from his chair, then stopped himself, voice raised. You want to talk about Logan Act? Where was this committee when John Kerry was holding climate talks without clearance? Where was the outrage when Blinken met with Iranian proxies in Geneva before even being confirmed? Dan stayed calm. If you're arguing for selective prosecution, we welcome that debate after this committee refers your case to the DOJ. Pam advanced the final point, because unlike Kerry or Blinken, you diverted funds over $800,000 worth from classified federal reserves, and worse, you've refused to disclose the scope or nature of your interactions, which places you not only outside protocol but outside accountability. Graham leaned forward. You think I'm afraid of a statute? No one's ever been jailed For Pam answered ice cold, "That's not a legal defense, that's a confession." Silence. Dan delivered the final line, "And in the absence of executive knowledge, the only foreign policy actor recognized by law is the president, not the Senate, not a senator, and certainly not a rogue trip funded by taxpayers to advance personal alliances under diplomatic disguise." The chairman finally responded, "We will recess for 30 minutes. Upon return, we will hear motions on investigative referral and potential subpoena expansion." The recess was brief, but it had been long enough for Graham's staff to distribute a thin 2-page brief to selected press outlets. By the time the committee reconvened, reporters were already whispering. Pam Bondi sat still, unaffected. Graham opened with a microphone tap, and the tone of a man cornered, but not yet defeated. "Before this hearing continues its theatrical descent, I request my statement enter the record, highlighting previously undisclosed financial entanglements of Miss Bondi, namely her documented association with legal firms directly affiliated with MAGA-aligned super PACs, including Liberty Action Council and Federalist Horizon." He slid a file toward the chair. "There exists an ongoing concern that this committee is being manipulated, weaponized by former Trump allies under the guise of accountability." Pam didn't flinch. She waited until the murmurs faded, then leaned forward, her voice precise and clipped. "Senator Graham, I have never received $1 from Liberty Action Council nor any PAC, federal or state. My income disclosures are public. I invite this body to inspect every page." She paused just long enough. "But while we're here, your most recent FEC filing shows $397,112 in contributions from defense contractors in April alone. That includes Northbridge Systems, whose CEO you met in Budapest the night before the unauthorized summit." The room shifted again. Graham's face tightened. Dan Bongino, who had been silent until now, broke in with a calm that sharpened the moment. "If I may. When a sitting senator attempts to deflect legal exposure by attacking the funding history of a former state official while simultaneously hiding the trail of taxpayer money used to negotiate foreign energy PACs, it becomes clear who is truly conflicted." Graham's voice rose. "Oh, come on, Dan, you're not even part of this committee. You're a glorified podcaster pretending to be a prosecutor, a mouthpiece for far-right extremists." Dan didn't blink. "And yet I'm the only one asking you questions you refused to answer. Maybe that's why your donors are whispering, because they're wondering when you became a liability." The chairman interrupted, not to defend Graham, but to shift the course. "Order. This committee will review Senator Graham's financial disclosures as part of a separate ethics inquiry. Furthermore, the Judiciary Subcommittee will consider a parallel investigation into procedural misconduct and potential Logan Act violations." Pam folded her papers. Calm but unyielding, Graham stared at her this time, not with fury but with the realization that the leverage he once held had slipped. "You think you've won something here?" Pam's reply came without hesitation. "I didn't come to win, Senator. I came to testify, and truth doesn't need permission to stand." The echo of Graham's question, "You think you've won?" hadn't yet faded when the clerk's voice broke the tension. "The hearing is now adjourned. The committee will issue referrals to the Senate Ethics Office within 48 hours. Pam remained motionless. Dan didn't speak either, but the silence was no longer passive. It was loaded, decisive, final. As lawmakers filed out, Senator Blumenthal approached Pam slowly and offered a curt nod. "Not many are willing to burn this bright." "Bondi," she replied without hesitation, "better to burn bright than rot quietly." Outside the chamber, reporters swarmed the hallway, but Graham refused every question. His only words, directed to no one in particular, were low and hoarse. "I gave everything for this country, and this is how I'm thanked." Dan, who overheard from a distance, turned toward Pam with a glance. "That's the thing with power. They mistake insulation for virtue until it leaks." Pam adjusted the folder in her hand and answered, "Let him whine. Ethics doesn't need applause, it just needs evidence." Back inside, the committee chair returned to the bench briefly, not to make a statement, but to retrieve a folder marked Logan violations. His aide whispered something inaudible, then handed him a sealed memo. The camera caught only the label "Preliminary Referral DOJOC Internal Obstruction Review Elsewhere." Rassen left through the back corridor without speaking to anyone. His aide, carrying a yellow notepad marked "Contingencies," quietly tore off the top page and dropped it into a trash can without pausing. On that page, barely visible, a single handwritten line: "If the narrative fails, bury the facts." Dan and Pam watched from the rotunda balcony as Graham's staff filed into a waiting SUV below. "You think the ethics committee will actually push sanctions?" Dan asked. "Not if the donors bark first," Pam replied. "But if they don't, the DO might." Dan nodded, his tone shifting from sarcastic to solemn. "He's not just a man, he's a signal. If he goes down quietly, someone hungrier will fill the vacuum." Pam looked him in the eye. Then we make the vacuum radioactive. As the building emptied, a janitor paused in the hearing room, confused by a single file left open on the table. It belonged to Dan. The page on top was underlined and circled in red ink. Truth doesn't require applause, it only requires survivors. The camera fades, but the consequence remains. The hearings had ended, but the unraveling had only begun. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.